Hi there, I'm Ben Hancox. I play the violin and I play in the Sacconi Quartet. We've been playing since 2001, so it's nearly 15 years, and same players, and that's the main thing I do. We've played concerts all around this country, Europe, and further afield, and that's wonderful. Also, I've done work, I record music in the studio and have done many projects for Spitfire, which is a really interesting and such a lovely contrast to the work that I do in the quartet. My parents introduced me to the violin when I was 4. I've got a little boy who's 4 now, so we're just deciding whether we should do the same to him. Yeah, it was kind of introduced to me, and you don't really have much say in things when you're that young, but it's a really, really good time to start playing a string instrument, because you're like a blank piece of paper, and it's very, very easy to teach as long as it's like a game. And I think when I was about 6, I was given the chance to say, right, okay, you can carry on, or you can leave it, and I decided to carry on. And it is I think all string instruments are really difficult to start, because there are no frets. You have to learn about you learn how to make a sound. The sound's not already there, and so for that reason, it's very helpful when you're little, because I think starting later on, you're much more self-critical, and it's a slow learning curve at the beginning. The violin family are amazing. The violin, I think, is just an extraordinary object. The design of it hasn't changed for hundreds of years. There have been small tweaks to it, the angle of the neck, the length of the fingerboard and things like that. But basically, the architecture of the violin hasn't changed since, the 18th century, even 17th century. So really, it's a perfectly designed acoustic box for making a beautiful sound. So you've got a hollow wooden box, and then you've got strings, 4 strings, which are at tension, and so you've got 2 points there that are static, and so when you pluck the strings vibrate here. And then you've got this bridge, which is which transmits the vibration of the strings to these to the wooden plates, and then because it's hollow, you've got a sound post in the middle as well. So these vibrations amplified, and we get the sound that we know as the violin. Yeah, how did I find my violin? Well, I've played many different violins throughout my life, and it's funny, I think they've almost always found me. Each one's had a story, and this one is a classic example. I've only had this since May, and so we're just getting to know one another. But this was made by Sacconi, who was a 20th century Italian maker, who ended up working in New York. And he is an incredible link back to the great Italian makers, notably Stradivari, because he managed to see hundreds of Stradivari's instruments when he was working in New York. He was the top restorer of instruments of his time, and so he had a knowledge of those instruments that is greater than probably anyone's has ever been. And as a result, he made not many instruments, because he was so busy as a restorer. But when he was younger, he did make some absolutely incredible instruments, and this is one of them. And my quartet is called the Sacconi Quartet. And so when this came up for sale, a friend rang me and said, "You must try it," because I'd played a Sacconi before, and I knew what fantastic instruments they were. And we just got along straight away. It's got an incredible response, and but it's a completely new journey as well, because they think that it hasn't been played very much since it was made in 1932. So it's had a new setup since May. It's had a new bridge made and a new sound post. So these are things that do change. So the bridge and the post are new. But apart from that, it's, you know, as it was pretty much when it came out of off his bench in New York in '32. Well, so response, I think, is very, very important, because, you know, as players, we want what we do to be transformed into sound, you know, as we expect. And some instruments speak more readily than others. And there's something about this violin that it's almost like it's wanting to do what you want it to do. And I've played violins that are a little bit more like, you've got to make me. And so each instrument has its own personality. And so for me, just the as soon as you touch the strings, there's an instant response, which is, as a player, very gratifying, because you know that what you're going to do is going to do something back, because not all instruments do that straight away. Sometimes you're having to slightly second guess what they're going to do. Bows are amazing, and there's as much to talk about with a bow as there is the violin. And really, obviously, this is how we make our sound. So it is it is of equal importance, actually. Of course, you have to have a violin that suits you, that works. But actually, without a bow that you feel you trust, and that makes the sound you want, you can't do anything. As a lot of people know, the greatest instruments came from Italy and from Cremona. And bows, there was a fantastic school of bow making in the 19th century in France. So this is a French bow from around 1850. So it's older than the violin, amazingly. And this is made by a maker called Malines, and it's an extraordinary stick. Bows, like violins, have personality as well. And it's amazing as players, as soon as you pick up a bow, you have a sense of its character. There's a kind of a generosity to this bow. It's a big, it's a very big, warm sound. I've got another bow in my case, which is almost like the antithesis. It's another French bow, but it's extremely clear and focused. But for me, the sound, bows hugely affect the sound that a violin makes, and the combination of bow and violin is absolutely crucial. A good bow might work really well on one violin, it might work terribly on well, not terribly, it might not work so well on another. So they're an amazing design, bow as in the sort of shape of the bow, but then you've got horsehair, which again is at tension. So we've got a screw here, which you can probably, hopefully see. I've taken the tension off there, so it really wouldn't make much sound. And then when we want to play, we increase the tension to about there. And the horsehair, we apply rosin, which is resin from the tree, which gives us friction. And so when you put the bow on the string, it grabs the string. You can actually feel a sort of stickiness, and so there's almost a sort of click sound that you can get if you press too hard. You'll hear just a sort of creaking noise. But that's the friction of the that you can get. So it's this amazing combination of stickiness, but also the fact that the bow glides as well. Yes, so violin bows, viola bows and cello bows are slightly different. Violin bows are lighter, and then as you go lower in the string family, they become heavier and also a little bit shorter. The difference between a violin and viola bow is quite slight, but it will be a matter of grams, probably about 10 grams difference. I think viola bows might be slightly longer as well, not sure on that. Cello bow is definitely shorter, and the shaft of the stick is thicker, and that's similar with double bass bows as well. Old versus new, there's an amazing school of modern bow makers as well. Great British makers, makers in Paris and all over Europe and further afield. It's also good to know now that there's so I'm told, a sustainable source of it's a tropical hardwood which is used. This is Pernambuco, which is a Brazilian hardwood, and as with a lot of these tropical woods, was endangered, but there are sustainable plantations of it now, and its properties are amazing because it has incredible strength, but also flexibility as well. And then also there's the characteristics of the wood itself, how it vibrates and how it causes the string to vibrate, which just means that wood is better than any other. So modern makers are using Pernambuco as well. There are other woods as well, but for me, I've never tried a bow that's not Pernambuco that is as good as this wood. The violin, unlike the cello, is and similar to the viola, is played up here. So it sits on the collarbone and also rest it on the shoulder. There are all sorts of different contraptions to try and make holding the violin here sort of more comfortable. So we have a chin rest here that was sort of a 19th century invention, I think, and then shoulder rests, which are still kind of being designed. This is quite a sort of modern, newfangled one, which is meant to allow the violin to vibrate more freely. But essentially these things are to try and make sort of holding the violin feel as comfortable as possible and give us as much freedom of movement with our left hand. So the best sound is usually when the bow is perpendicular to the bridge. And so the bow, when you draw the bow across the strings vibrate, and then that vibration is passed through the body of the instrument. So you can probably see the string vibrating, and then it carries on resonating after you've played it. Unlike a guitar, violin doesn't have frets, and so we have to learn where the notes are on the string. But also what that gives us room to do is play with expressive intonation as well, and so we can shade notes slightly higher or lower for when we need to, and also interestingly to play completely in tune. If we're very careful. That's possible with string instruments in a way that's not possible, for example, on a piano that's tuned to modern day pitch, which is a sort of a compromise in many ways. Basic techniques of the violin. If we start with the bow, the most normal is just détaché bowing, which is just up and down essentially, and that's we call that on the string bowing. There's a whole sort of range of different ways we can use the bow. So if we take that as on the string, then we have lots and lots of different techniques for playing off the string as well, which is if we want sort of lighter, sort of spiccato, or we can play or a sort of flying spiccato like that. You can have different attacks on the notes. So instead of starting, you can just find a biting point and you can play accent that wasn't so good. Accent the note. So we can have a sort of very sharp, which we call martelé. We can also drop the bow onto the string because there's a natural bounce in the bow that we can use for sort of jeté or thrown bow strokes. Or you can also make the bow jump across the string, for different effects like that. The other thing that makes a big difference to the sound is how close the bow is to the bridge. So the best sort of our normal sound is usually between the fingerboard and the bridge. If we go further away from the bridge, you get more sort of air in the sound. It's sometimes called flautato or soltato, which is on the fingerboard. So if you do that more to the extreme, you get a very, very airy sound. If we draw the bow close to the bridge, the sound starts to distort. And that's all to do with the weight, the speed, but then how close we are to the bridge. But then there's a technique called sul ponticella, which is on the bridge, when you get this very a very sort of glassy, scary sound. There's the tremolo bowing, where we move the bow very fast, which is used a lot in sort of modern writing and for effects. And that can be, I think I played that sort of pretty much in the middle of the string between, but if you could do tremolo flautato or tremolo ponticello. So string choice is something that makes a huge difference to the colour and character of the sounds that we make. So we have positions, as in, so the first position is just all of the notes sort of where we don't move sort of higher up the fingerboard. So that's all in first position, using all of the strings. Also, we have the four, if we don't use our fingers on the strings, we call them the open strings. And sometimes it's really nice to exploit the open characteristics of those strings, because there's, as soon as you stop the string, there's a different kind of characteristic to the sound. To the open strings have the most resonance, and so depending on the effect you want, if you want the sort of the most sonorous open sounds, keys that use the open strings on the instruments are really effective. So particularly if you think of a lot of the most famous violin concertos, they're in D major, because we have those two D major and G major chords are very, very resonant and open on the violin. So the characters of the strings themselves, the G is the lowest, and then the E is the thinnest and the highest. If you want something to sound as rich as possible, then we'll try and keep it on the G string. So an example is, there's a piece for violin called Cigane by Ravel. There's a part of it that it sounds that he writes it on the G string. Which gives a much wider, more rich sound. So the higher we go up the G string, you have a big sort of bold sound. That can be continued on the... That can be continued on the D, but already the character of the violin's changing. There's still a richness, but it's very different to the G string. As we go up to the A string, we've got sort of beginning to have a sort of a brightness, but hopefully still warmth that we have from the lower strings as well. There's a big difference between the A and the E string. So if we take particularly the open E strings, are very bright character. So if we play on the E string, there's a sort of very, very vibrant sound, and sometimes composers want to use those pitches but not have the same brightness, and so that's worth writing on the A string. So if you have this and then you've got those two different colours. So there's a sort of sweetness on the A string and then a brightness that we associate with the E string. That is then has the sort of the most projection and power. So if we don't use the bow, we call it pizzicato, which is plucking. And so the plucking the open strings sounds like that. There's various sort of different sounds you can get with pizzicato. Usually, again, we try and to try and get the most resonance. We pluck the string sort of around here, around the sort of halfway. But if we pluck nearer the bridge, you sort of get a drier pizzicato sound. There's the Bartok pizz, which is where the string slaps against the fingerboard. If you pull it up, it actually hits the fingerboard, and we get that very percussive effect. That really doesn't work on the higher strings. You can't do a Bartok pizz on the higher string. I mean, it just, you can't pull it hard enough to actually hit the fingerboard. So that's worth remembering. It's just about possible on the A string, but Bartok pizz work best on the lower strings, really. You can play chords, and it's possible also to play with the left hand as well. So you can pluck with the left hand, which gives you know, certain makes certain things easier at times. Double stops, you can play more than one string at a time. Writing double stops, it's important to just know that we can put our fingers down comfortably. Thirds work well. Thirds are common on the violin and quite easy to play. Also fourths. And then you can also incorporate open strings as well. So you can or you can have a lot of resonance. Fifths are, even though the strings are a fifth apart, they're to write lots and lots of parallel fifths are quite hard for intonation on string instruments. So especially going higher and higher, it's hard to keep fifths in tune because of the angles of the fingers. So really anything up to an octave is possible. Those are all comfortable on the violin. I think a sort of common misconception in writing for a very long time is writing octaves quite often doesn't sound louder than writing just one note, because you have to play in a certain way to keep the two strings vibrating. It's often, if you want something as strong as possible, it's easier to write and more effective to write one note than octaves, in my opinion. So a few more techniques. One that's used a lot by sort of older composers and modern composers is the mute, which is this rubber thingy here, which we put on the bridge. And what that does is it just dampens the vibrations of the bridge. So if I play... and then with the mute... what's interesting is the mute doesn't always make... I mean, it almost warms the sound up. It is quieter as well, and it does allow us to play more freely without making as much sound. But there's a warmth to a muted sound, which is really, really effective for certain types of music. There are different types of mutes as well. You can get sort of bigger mutes. This is sometimes called a practice mute, but I really like this one because it's rubber as well. But you can really sort of play into the violin, but it sort of it kind of keeps a warmth. Some heavy mutes, you begin to get a kind of metallic sound. So there's loads of different options, but most players, if you were writing for orchestra or a string quartet or something like this, if you wrote con soldino, then they would be putting a mute on like this, unless you particularly specified. And there are composers who have specified a certain type of mute because they have a certain type of sound in mind. You can sort of do strange things like sometimes play behind the bridge. I mean, that's just going to give you a kind of squeaky, quite nasty, pretty horrible. There's this kind of sound that's used quite a lot in piazzolla tangos, which is this kind of crunchy sound, which is made behind the bridge. You can, if we play, basically the bow is heaviest at the heel or the frog and lightest at the tip. So if you want very sort of strong attack, then you want down bows at the heel. And if you want really sort of light stuff, then we use a lighter part of the bow. So legato techniques, we've got when we're using a smooth bow, if we shift and we don't disguise the shift, you get a slide, and that can be used for expressivity or for or it can be slow or very, very fast. So there's a lot of scope for portamenti and glissandi and effects like that. Harmonics are where you partially stop the string, but you don't put your finger all the way down. The four main harmonics are at the half, stopping the string halfway. But then you can go sort of higher and higher as you shorten the length of the string that's vibrating. You get the harmonic series. So those are written with the little circle, as I'm sure composers know already. The other thing we can do is have stopped harmonics. So we can put one finger down. So if we put the first finger down, then we can then we have the option of playing any note as a harmonic. You get a slightly less open sound with a stopped harmonic. If I find an example, that's a stopped harmonic, and then that's a natural harmonic. And so again, it's a little bit like using an open string compared to putting a finger on the string. So there are slightly different characteristics to harmonics. And I think when writing for harmonics, it's difficult to hugely vary the dynamic. You can't, because of the way the string reacts, there's just not a massive dynamic range. You can play very, very quietly, but again, there's a limit. If you don't move the bow fast enough, then you just won't have any sound at all. Also, if you try and play too loud, then the note will distort, and so there's less room for dynamic range in harmonics. Okay, so col legno is a technique, literally means with the wood, where you're not using the horsehair. Players are often, not always keen to do that with an expensive bow, because it can damage the stick. So you just need to be careful to use it sparingly, or give players due warning. If they were going to do 3 hours of col legno on a session, they'd need to know well in advance. It's possible to use a pencil as well, but really it's good to use a cheap bow. And the sound you get is a sort of very, it's percussive. And as you notice as well, like the Bartók pizzicato, you get the most sound lower down. Holst uses it in the Planets famously. Again, it's really, really hard to do huge dynamic range. You can, that's about as hard as I can hit it without doing some damage. Also, interestingly, depending on where you drop it, you can get different notes, which is something you don't hear very much actually. But I think you get a lovely sort of. I really like that colour of different pitches of col legno as well. That's not experimented with very much in my experience. I think if you haven't written for the violin before and you want to, the things to remember, of course, the most important thing is the range of the instrument. You can't go lower than this note unless you start talking about scordatura, which is tuning the pegs down, but then you start getting into quite dangerous territory. So G is your lowest note. The violin can go really, really high. So that's a sort of top E. And you can obviously, you can go higher than that as well. But probably, if you use sort of the E there, around there to the bottom G, you've got a lot of range to play with. We've talked about the sort of colour choice for strings, but I think the most important thing for any composer is to write what they're feeling, and then it's the player's job to interpret. I sometimes think that less markings are sometimes more helpful, because it's inviting the player who knows their instrument and plays all the time to make a few choices. Of course, there are certain things like you want an attack at the heel or something very, very light. But sometimes if you see a part that's thoroughly marked because somebody has a very, very clear idea of what they want, sometimes there can be so much information on the page that you start to feel a bit kind of like, what should I be doing here? But as a player, you want to see some music, and then with your experience try and do it in the most beautiful way possible, or the most effective way possible, and work with the composer for to get that result. It gives you a lot of freedom, really. You just, depending on whether it looks like a fast or a slow piece of music, if there's really nothing, and not even a sort of a marking to the sort of character, it might be quite difficult to straight away get what the composer means. But at the same time, it invites the player to add some character themselves as well. So again, it's down to the experience and skill of the player to try and bring that off the page. I think the strengths are the brilliance of the upper strings. It's around there, but also then the richness that we talked about earlier. The richness of the G string. That's two things. So depending on sort of how many instruments you're writing for, you might be treating the violin as the treble, the upper line, the sort of leading line. So a lot of sort of melodies are sort of written in the sort of the higher register. I don't mean extreme high register, but sort of in the probably on the D, A, and E string, and not the G string, because, for example, in my quartet, usually you've got the cello providing bass and the viola and second violin adding sort of harmony, and first violin playing melody. That's a massively simplified version, but the violin is very adept at playing melodies, but also it can do all sorts of other stuff as well. Most common errors. I think sometimes you see quite a lot when stuff comes through Sibelius. Sometimes missed out accidentals and enharmonic changes. To go from an F sharp in one bar to a G flat in another bar is quite, when you're trying to read something quickly, it's quite hard. So to just, when you're looking as a composer at what is on the page, imagining that you're seeing that for the first time, it wants to be as readable, legible as possible. I think if you're writing extremely high for the violin, it's best to write it lower and then to write, one octave higher, and to use that notation, because once it starts getting above, 4 ledger lines, so you've got the G, probably if you go above G or A, or even the B above that, then you want to start writing, go back down to lower and write up, write up the octave, because otherwise you start, it's difficult to read. So that's one thing I would say that's very useful for players. Basically, obviously, the closer you are with the microphone, the more of the sort of the production of the sound you're going to hear. So if right by my ear I can hear, you can hear sort of very much the noise before the string starts to move, and so it really depends on sort of how much focus and also how much room you want. And I think engineers will know far better than me, but if you've got a lovely room, you want to exploit the character of the room, because all string instruments benefit from being in a resonant space. If you're in a very dry room, even the greatest violin's not going to sound amazing, because the sound is being absorbed. So if you're in a dry room, then obviously you're going to probably want to add some nice quality reverb to it, because anything that's just dry is not, in my opinion, unless you're going for a certain effect, it's not that nice to listen to.